London, April 15th, 1815. The candles in Lady Pembroke's grand ballroom flickered like 1,000 restless stars, their light reflecting off polished marble floors, where the cream of society swirled in patterns as rigid as the hierarchy they represented. Miss Beatrice Thornhill stood near the terrace doors, a pale ghost in remade blue silk that had once graced her mother's slender frame in happier times, watching the dancers with the careful composure of one who had learned not to hope. 28 years old. 7 seasons endured. Not a single proposal to show for her patient attendance at these glittering assemblies where younger, prettier girls secured their futures while she faded ever further into the wallpaper. The whispers reached her even here in her chosen refuge, carried on the warm spring breeze that drifted through the open windows. Poor Miss Thornhill, still unwed, plain as pudding and twice as dull. One would think her aunt would spare them all the embarrassment and keep her home. Lady Caroline Pembroke's voice, sharp and carrying, cut through the music with practiced cruelty. I cannot imagine why she continues to attend. Some women simply must accept their limitations. Beatrice felt the familiar tightening in her chest, that peculiar ache of being perpetually invisible, yet somehow always observed, always found wanting. Beside her, Miss Eleanor Fairfax, loyal friend of 5 years and Beatrice's single anchor in these treacherous social waters, pressed her hand in silent solidarity. Eleanor, blessed with beauty and a comfortable fortune, could have abandoned Beatrice for more advantageous connections, yet she remained steadfast, a grace Beatrice treasured above all others. The ballroom blazed with colour and motion, silks and satins in jewel tones, ostrich plumes nodding above elaborate coiffures, the gentlemen elegant in their evening dress as they partnered the season's hopeful debutantes. Beatrice catalogued her own deficiencies with the precision of long practice. Too tall, features too strong, hair a nondescript brown, figure unfashionably slender. No fortune, no connections beyond her aunt's modest standing. Nothing to recommend her except a sharp mind that no one wanted, and a kind heart that no one noticed. She had made her peace with spinsterhood, or so she told herself during the long nights when sleep would not come. There were worse fates than a quiet life in her aunt's household, managing the accounts and reading her beloved books. Yet something in her refused to be entirely resigned, some stubborn ember that flared painfully at moments like these, watching others claim the joy she had been denied. The orchestra swelled into a country dance. Beatrice retreated further into her shadowed corner, content to observe, to endure, to survive another evening with her dignity intact. And then the Duke of Harrington arrived, late and clearly reluctant, his tall frame appearing in the ballroom entrance with an air of weary obligation, his dark eyes sweeping across the assembly with the detached assessment of a man fulfilling a duty rather than seeking pleasure, and though Beatrice did not know it yet, everything was about to change. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. Alexander Harrington had endured precisely 3 months in Vienna, negotiating treaties with men who valued posturing over progress, and he had returned to London with a bone-deep weariness of artifice that made these glittering assemblies feel like elaborate prisons dressed in silk. Lord Thomas Westbrook, his friend since Eton, and one of the few men whose company he genuinely valued, appeared at his elbow with 2 glasses of champagne and a knowing look that spoke of shared suffering. "You have that expression again," Thomas observed, his tone dry as dust. "The one that makes ambitious mothers reconsider their campaigns." "Good," Alexander replied. Accepting the glass but not drinking, Perhaps they will spare me the theatrics this evening." Thomas laughed quietly. "You know they will not. Lady Pembroke has been circling like a hawk since you entered, and she has that determined gleam that means she intends to thrust her daughter at you before the night concludes." Alexander felt his jaw tighten. "Miss Pembroke is a lovely girl who deserves a husband who can tolerate more than 5 minutes of conversation about fashion and weather. I am not that man." "You are too particular," Thomas said without heat. "What exactly are you seeking in a wife?" "Someone real," Alexander answered, surprised by his own vehemence. "Someone who thinks, who feels, who has not been trained into perfect insipid agreeability." His gaze drifted across the ballroom, cataloguing the usual scene with detached observation. The swirl of pastels and jewels, the calculated laughter, the practiced flirtations that held all the authenticity of stage performances. Somewhere in this glittering crowd there must be one woman who was more than her dowry and her deportment. But 7 years of searching had yielded nothing but disappointment. Near the terrace doors, half hidden in shadow, stood 2 women he did not recognize, one fair and fashionably dressed, the other taller and plainer in pale blue silk that had seen better days. Even from this distance he could see the quietness about them, the way they stood apart from the swirling social dance, observers rather than participants. The country dance ended, and the orchestra began shuffling music for the next set. Couples reformed on the floor. Alexander noticed Lady Pembroke detaching herself from a cluster of matrons. Her daughter Lydia in tow, trajectory aimed directly at him with the inevitability of cannon fire. Thomas noticed too. "Brace yourself," he murmured. "Perhaps claim a previous engagement." Alexander considered retreat, then dismissed it. He was a duke, a veteran of diplomatic negotiations, perfectly capable of deflecting one ambitious mother with civility intact. He set his untouched champagne on a passing servant's tray and turned to face the approaching assault with the patience of a man who had learned to endure unpleasant necessities. The orchestra's conductor raised his baton, and the opening strains of a waltz began to fill the perfumed air, and Lady Pembroke smiled with the confidence of a woman who believed her victory already secured. Lady Caroline Pembroke swept across the ballroom floor with the practiced grace of a general positioning troops for battle, her daughter Lydia trailing behind like a beautifully dressed banner meant to attract the proper attention, and Alexander felt the familiar weight of tedious obligation settle across his shoulders as he prepared to deflect yet another transparently ambitious campaign for his title and fortune. "Your Grace," Lady Caroline began, her smile sharp enough to cut glass, "what a delight to find you in attendance this evening. May I present my daughter, Miss Lydia Pembroke? I believe you have not yet had the pleasure of a proper introduction." Lydia curtsied with flawless deportment, her blonde ringlets arranged to perfection, her rosebud mouth curved in a practiced smile that held all the authenticity of a stage performance, and Alexander felt nothing but weary recognition of the type. "Miss Pembroke," he acknowledged with polite correctness, bowing precisely the required degree. Lady Caroline pressed her advantage, her hand already reaching as if to physically place her daughter's palm in his. "The waltz is about to begin, Your Grace. Surely you cannot have already engaged a partner, having only just arrived." Alexander considered the woman before him, this pretty girl who had been trained since birth to secure exactly this sort of match, who likely had thoughts and feelings buried somewhere beneath the layers of social conditioning, but would never be permitted to express them. And he felt a sudden sharp exhaustion with the entire cruel machinery of their world. "I must decline," he said clearly, his voice carrying further than strictly necessary in the sudden lull of conversation around them. "Miss Pembroke is a charming young lady, but I am not seeking a dance partner this evening." The words landed like stones in still water, ripples of reaction spreading outward as nearby guests registered the refusal and its implications. Lady Caroline's smile froze into something brittle and dangerous. "Surely your Grace cannot be so difficult to please," she said, her tone edged with poorly concealed offence. "My daughter is considered one of the season's greatest beauties." "I do not doubt it," Alexander replied with unflinching honesty. "But beauty alone does not constitute compatibility. I am seeking something more substantial than a pleasing appearance and proper deportment. I am seeking someone genuine." The social murmur that followed his declaration rippled through the assembled guests like wind through wheat, and across the ballroom, half hidden by the refreshment table where she had retreated to escape notice. Beatrice Thornhill heard every word with a peculiar shock of recognition that even dukes, for all their privilege and power, were trapped by the same suffocating expectations that had crushed her own hopes season after season. Lady Caroline drew herself up with wounded dignity, her face flushed with poorly suppressed fury. "I see," she said coldly. "Come, Lydia. There are gentlemen here with better manners and more appreciation for quality." She swept away with her mortified daughter in tow, leaving Alexander standing alone as the orchestra began the opening strains of the waltz and couples moved toward the floor in swirling pairs of color and motion. Thomas appeared at his shoulder, eyebrows raised in sardonic appreciation. "That was spectacularly undiplomatic," he observed. "You have made an enemy there." Alexander shrugged, his gaze drifting across the ballroom toward the terrace doors where the warm spring air beckoned with the promise of escape from this glittering prison. "She will recover," he said absently. "Her daughter will marry well regardless. I am simply weary of pretending interest I do not feel." Near the refreshment table, Eleanor's brother arrived to claim his sister for the waltz, and Eleanor cast an apologetic glance at Beatrice before allowing herself to be led away. Leaving Beatrice entirely alone as the music swelled and the dancers began to move in graceful circles that seemed to mock her perpetual exclusion, and something in her, some long-buried ember of defiance, suddenly flared into reckless flame. Beatrice Thornhill had endured 7 seasons of standing at the edges of ballrooms, watching other women dance, had perfected the art of appearing content, while her heart slowly calcified into something hard and safe. But in this moment, standing alone near the refreshment table, with the opening strains of the waltz floating through the warm spring air, and every couple in the room pairing off with the practiced ease of people who belonged to this glittering world in ways she never had and never would, something inside her cracked open like an egg revealing not the expected emptiness, but a hot, bright yolk of defiance that surprised her with its intensity. The terrace doors stood open, spilling moonlight across the stone floor in silver pools, and the music beckoned with a sweetness that felt like both invitation and mockery. And before she could think better of it, before prudence and propriety and 28 years of learning to make herself small could reassert their familiar tyranny, Beatrice set down her untouched glass of lemonade and walked through those doors into the night air that smelled of roses and possibility. The terrace stretched empty before her, flagstones still warm from the day's sun, torches burning in their iron brackets casting dancing shadows that seemed to move in time with the waltz drifting from the ballroom, and she thought with sudden crystalline clarity that if no man would ever dance with her, if she was destined to die a spinster in her aunt's cramped townhouse with nothing but regrets and might-have-beens for company, then she would give herself this one thing, this single waltz under the moon where no one could see her presumption and no one could witness her longing. She closed her eyes and raised her arms in the proper position, one hand extended as if holding an invisible partner, the other curved as if resting on a phantom shoulder. And she began to move, tentatively at first, and then with growing confidence as the music swelled, and her body remembered what her heart had never forgotten. The rise and fall and turn of the waltz that she had practiced as a girl in her father's study when she still believed that someday someone would want to dance with her. The moonlight painted her pale blue silk dress in shades of pearl and shadow, and she spun slowly across the terrace stones with her eyes closed and her face tilted toward the stars, lost in the music and the movement and the bittersweet pleasure of this stolen moment of grace, completely unaware that inside the ballroom a duke had turned his head at the glimpse of movement in his peripheral vision, that Alexander Harrington had frozen mid-conversation with Thomas to watch the solitary figure waltzing alone in the moonlight with a kind of arrested attention that felt like recognition, that something in him, some long-dormant capacity for wonder, had suddenly sparked to life at the sight of this woman dancing as if her heart depended on it, with no audience but the night sky and no partner but her own stubborn hope. Beatrice moved through the waltz in a state of such pure absorption that the rest of the world had fallen away like discarded silk, her body remembering the steps her dancing master had taught her when she was 15, and still believed her life would unfold according to the pattern laid out for young ladies of modest fortune and respectable family, before 7 seasons of rejection had taught her that some women were destined to watch from the margins, while others claimed the center of the ballroom floor, and she spun slowly across the terrace flagstones, with her eyes closed and her face tilted upward toward the stars that glittered like scattered diamonds across the velvet darkness of the spring sky, so lost in the bittersweet pleasure of this stolen moment that she did not hear the footsteps crossing the terrace behind her, did not sense the presence of the man who moved toward her with the inevitability of tide drawn by moon, did not know that Alexander Harrington had abandoned Thomas mid-sentence and crossed through the open terrace doors with his attention fixed entirely on her solitary figure, as if she were the only real thing in a world of beautiful artifice. The music swelled toward its crescendo, and Beatrice spun faster, her pale blue skirts floating outward in a bell of silk that caught the torchlight and transformed it into something magical. And Alexander reached her just as she completed the turn, his hands closing firmly but gently around her waist to steady her motion, to stop her mid-spin with the certainty of someone catching something precious before it could fall, and the sudden pressure of his palms against the curve of her stays shocked through her like lightning striking dry timber. Her eyes flew open, and she found herself staring directly into a face she had only glimpsed from across crowded rooms, the face of the Duke of Harrington, who stood close enough that she could see the fine lines at the corners of his grey eyes, and smell the subtle scent of sandalwood and something else distinctly masculine that made her breath catch in her throat, and mortification flooded through her in a hot wave that turned her skin scarlet from her hairline to the modest neckline of her mother's remade dress. She tried to step backward, but his hands remained steady at her waist, not gripping but holding, his touch firm enough to keep her from fleeing, but gentle enough to feel like question rather than command. And he studied her face with an intensity that made her want to close her eyes again. But she forced herself to meet his gaze, because if she was going to be ruined by this scandal, then she would at least face it with whatever dignity remained to her. "Are you quite well?" he asked quietly, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear it, despite the growing crowd of observers gathering in the terrace doorway, their whispers rising like the hiss of disturbed geese, and Lady Caroline's scandalized face was visible among them, but Beatrice could not look away from the man before her to catalogue the full extent of her social destruction. "I am well," she managed to stammer, her voice emerging thin and breathless. "I apologize, Your Grace. I did not mean to create a spectacle." His hands had not moved from her waist, and she became suddenly aware that they were still positioned as if dancing, as if he had stepped into the role of her invisible partner and claimed it for himself, and the music continued to play inside the ballroom, the waltz moving toward its final bars while they stood frozen in this moment that seemed to exist outside normal time. "You dance beautifully," Alexander said, and there was something in his voice that sounded like wonder, like surprise, like a man discovering something valuable where he had not thought to look, and Beatrice felt her mortification deepen, because surely he was mocking her. Surely this was some elaborate cruelty being perpetrated by a man who could have any woman in London, but had chosen instead to humiliate the one foolish enough to waltz alone under the stars like some pathetic spinster grasping at dreams that would never belong to her. "You mock me," Beatrice said, and the words emerged sharper than she intended, edged with 7 years of accumulated hurt, and the particular bitter clarity that comes when a woman has nothing left to lose, because her reputation is already shredding itself to ribbons in the whispers of the crowd gathered in the terrace doorway, watching this unprecedented spectacle unfold, and she saw something shift in Alexander's grey eyes. Surprise giving way to understanding, and then to something that looked almost like respect as his hands finally dropped from her waist. Though he did not step back, did not create the proper distance that society demanded between unmarried persons of opposite gender, and he remained close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body in the cool spring air and smell the sandalwood scent that clung to his perfectly tailored evening clothes. "I do not mock you," he said quietly, his voice pitched for her ears alone, despite their audience. "I am asking a genuine question. Why did you dance alone when the ballroom was full of partners?" And Beatrice felt a hysterical laugh rising in her throat, because surely the Duke of Harrington, with his title and fortune and face that made debutantes stumble over their own feet, could not be so disconnected from reality that he failed to understand why a plain 28-year-old spinster might find herself without a partner for the waltz or any other dance. Her first instinct was to lie, to offer some polite fiction about preferring solitude or needing air, but mortification and defiance had burned away her usual caution, and she found herself meeting his gaze with a directness that would have scandalized her aunt, and saying with blunt honesty, "Because some dances are for oneself alone, Your Grace. When no one else will have you, one must either dance alone or not dance at all, and I find I am tired of not dancing." She watched his expression shift again, watched understanding deepen into something that might have been anger, except it was not directed at her, but rather at the glittering, cruel world that had relegated her to the margins, and he smiled suddenly, a real smile that transformed his usually severe features into something warm and almost boyish, and said, "Then you understand more than most about the difference between performance and genuine feeling. Dukes likely never understand such things," Beatrice said, and was shocked to hear the edge of wit in her own voice, the spark of her personality that she had learned to suppress emerging despite her mortification. "You have every dance you desire and every partner who catches your eye." "You would be surprised," Alexander said, and there was something rueful in his tone, "at how many dances are obligations rather than desires, how many partners see only the coronet and not the man beneath it." And Beatrice found herself arrested by this unexpected glimpse of isolation within privilege, this suggestion that perhaps loneliness wore many faces, and even dukes might understand what it meant to be seen only for what one represented, rather than who one was. The music was ending, the final bars of the waltz fading into silence that felt weighted with expectation, and she became aware again of their audience and the scandal blooming around them like poisonous flowers, and Eleanor was pushing through the crowd with determination written across her kind face, while Thomas appeared to be blocking Lady Caroline's attempted approach with strategic conversation. and Alexander seemed entirely unconcerned with any of it as he executed a proper bow and said formally, "I do not believe we have been properly introduced. I am Alexander Harrington, and would very much like to request permission to call on you tomorrow if you would be willing to receive me." Beatrice stared at him, certain she had misheard, certain this was some fever dream brought on by too many seasons of disappointment, but his grey eyes were steady and serious, and waiting for her answer, and she found herself sinking into an automatic curtsy, while her mind spun in confused circles, trying to understand what was happening. Why the most sought-after man in London was requesting to call on the most overlooked woman, and her voice emerged smaller than she intended when she whispered, "I am Miss Beatrice Thornhill, Your Grace. And yes, you may call, though I cannot fathom why you would wish to." Beatrice woke on the morning of April the 16th, after a night spent staring at the ceiling of her small bedroom in the narrow townhouse on the unfashionable edge of Mayfair, where she lived with her Aunt Harriet, her mind replaying the events on the terrace over and over like a music box mechanism stuck on the same phrase, unable to believe that the Duke of Harrington had truly requested permission to call on her, or that she had not imagined the entire scandalous encounter in some fever dream brought on by too many years of disappointment and suppressed longing. She descended to breakfast at 10, with shadows under her eyes, to find her aunt already seated at the scarred oak table in their modest dining room, her thin face set in lines of such profound disapproval that Beatrice knew the gossip had already reached their household through the efficient network of servants who carried scandal between houses faster than any written correspondence could travel. Aunt Harriet said nothing during the meal, merely passed Beatrice the toast with movements sharp enough to convey volumes of censure, and Beatrice ate mechanically, while her stomach churned with anxiety, and her mind whispered that of course Alexander had not meant his request seriously. Of course it had been some aristocratic impulse of pity or perhaps elaborate cruelty. Of course she would never hear from him again, and would spend the rest of her life known as the pathetic spinster who danced alone on terraces and somehow deluded herself that dukes might notice her. The lecture began as soon as the maid cleared the breakfast dishes, Aunt Harriet's voice cold and precise as she catalogued all the ways Beatrice had humiliated herself and damaged what little remained of her reputation, dancing alone like some mad woman, creating a spectacle that would be discussed in every drawing-room in London, throwing away the last shreds of respectability that might have secured her some position as governess or companion when Harriet herself passed on and left Beatrice entirely without protection or income. Beatrice absorbed the familiar litany of her failures and inadequacies with the numb resignation of someone who had heard variations of this speech for 7 years, her internal certainty growing that Alexander's request had indeed been meaningless, and she was preparing to excuse herself to her room when the sound of the door-knocker echoed through the house with unusual authority. The footman appeared moments later, carrying a silver salver that held a crisp white calling card, and Aunt Harriet snatched it up with fingers that trembled slightly as she read the engraved name, her face transforming from pinched disapproval to stunned calculation in the space of a heartbeat. And she looked at Beatrice with new eyes, as if seeing her for the first time in years. Before either of them could speak, the knocker sounded again, and the footman returned, struggling under the weight of a massive arrangement of white roses, 3 dozen perfect blooms that filled the modest entry hall with their perfume, and made Aunt Harriet gasp audibly. And tucked among the flowers was a note in bold, masculine handwriting requesting permission to call on Miss Thornhill at 2 that afternoon if she would be so gracious as to receive him, signed simply Alexander Harrington. Beatrice spent the hours between the delivery of the roses and Alexander's anticipated arrival in a state of anxious preparation that her aunt orchestrated with the precision of a military campaign, insisting that Beatrice change from her morning dress of faded muslin into her best day gown of lavender silk that had been purchased 3 seasons ago and was slightly out of fashion, but still respectable. And Aunt Harriet herself supervised the arrangement of the drawing-room with its shabby but genteel furniture, positioning the tea service on the small table near the window where the grey afternoon light filtering through the spring rain would be most flattering, and she instructed the maid to build up the fire against the damp chill and to have fresh tea ready. The moment His Grace arrived, her entire manner transformed from this morning's cold disapproval into something approaching warmth, though Beatrice recognized it as the calculated warmth of someone who had suddenly seen possibility where before there had been only resignation and burden. At precisely 2 in the afternoon, the door-knocker sounded with punctual authority, and Beatrice felt her heart leap into her throat as the footman showed Alexander into their modest drawing-room, where he seemed to fill the small space with his presence, his tall frame and broad shoulders making their furnishings appear even more worn than usual, though his expression showed nothing but polite interest as Aunt Harriet performed the formal introductions with trembling hands and obvious delight, and Alexander bowed over her aunt's hand with exactly the right degree of respect, before turning to Beatrice with eyes that held warmth and something that might have been amusement at the transparent eagerness of her chaperone. The ritual of tea unfolded with agonizing slowness, Aunt Harriet pouring from her best china service, while maintaining a steady stream of conversation about the weather and the season and mutual acquaintances, and Alexander responded with easy charm that gradually won her aunt's complete approval, answering her increasingly bold questions about his properties and his time in Vienna with patient good humor, while his gaze kept returning to Beatrice, who sat silent and nervous on the worn settee, trying to understand what was happening and why this man who could have any woman in England was sitting in her shabby drawing-room drinking tea and listening to her aunt's chatter as though there were nowhere else he would rather be. When he finally turned his attention directly to Beatrice and asked about her interests and occupations, she responded with careful guardedness, born of years of learning that honest answers about her love of reading and walking and observing the world were considered unfashionable in a society that valued accomplishments like watercolors and Italian songs, but something in his steady attention encouraged her to mention that she had been reading Wordsworth, and his face lit with genuine interest as he noticed the volume of poetry sitting on the side table near her usual chair, its worn binding evidence of frequent reading, and their conversation about the lake poets and the relationship between nature and emotion flowed with surprising ease until Aunt Harriet was called away by the housekeeper with what Beatrice suspected was strategic timing, leaving them alone for the first time since the terrace. In the sudden quiet, Alexander leaned forward slightly and said with direct simplicity that cut through all pretense, "I want you to understand that my interest is entirely serious, Miss Thornhill. I am not calling on you out of pity or whim, but because I find you genuinely captivating, and I intend to court you properly if you will allow it." And Beatrice stared at him with disbelief written across her face as she whispered that she could not fathom why he would choose her when he could have any accomplished beauty in London, and he smiled with patience and said quietly that perhaps she would come to understand in time that he valued authenticity over accomplishment and character over conventional beauty. And before she could form a response, he asked permission to call again tomorrow, and she found herself nodding in tentative agreement while her mind spun with confused hope and lingering doubt. And after he departed with proper formality, Aunt Harriet returned full of excited plans about new gowns and social engagements, while Beatrice sat frozen in her chair, struggling to protect her heart against hope, even as hope bloomed dangerously bright within her chest. On the bright spring afternoon of April 18th, Alexander arrived at the modest townhouse on the edge of Mayfair at precisely 3 in the afternoon, leading not only his magnificent black stallion, but also a gentle chestnut mare with kind eyes and elegant lines. And when Beatrice emerged in the dark green riding habit she had borrowed from Eleanor, feeling self-conscious about the slightly outdated cut, and the way it hung loose in places where Eleanor's figure was more generous than her own. She found Alexander waiting with an expression of such warm approval that her nervousness eased fractionally, and he told her with quiet pleasure that he had remembered her mentioning during their previous visit that she had loved to ride as a girl, before her father's death had necessitated the sale of their country property and horses, and the fact that he had not only remembered this detail, but acted upon it with such thoughtful preparation, made something tender unfurl in her chest even as her mind whispered warnings about hoping too much. They set out toward Hyde Park through streets still damp from morning rain, the afternoon sun breaking through clouds to illuminate the fresh green of new leaves on the plane trees lining the roads. And as they rode, Alexander asked her questions that drew out her thoughts on subjects ranging from the poetry they had discussed to her observations about London after so many seasons navigating its social waters, and she found herself responding with increasing honesty as his genuine interest in her answers became unmistakable, her habitual guardedness slowly dissolving under the steady warmth of his attention the way frost melts under spring sun. They entered Hyde Park during the fashionable hour when society paraded along Rotten Row to see and be seen, and Beatrice felt the familiar tension return to her shoulders as heads turned to observe the Duke of Harrington riding beside the unremarkable Miss Thornhill, whispers following in their wake like ripples spreading across still water. But Alexander seemed entirely unconcerned with the attention, positioning his stallion slightly closer to her mare in a manner that felt protective and proprietary. And when they encountered Lady Caroline Pembroke, driving her barouche with her daughter Lydia seated beside her in elaborate pink muslin, Caroline's smile was all sharp edges and false sweetness, as she remarked how charming it was to see His Grace taking pity on those less fortunate souls who lacked regular invitations to ride. And Alexander's response was coolly civil, as he observed that he chose his riding companions based on the quality of their conversation rather than the quantity of their social engagements, and he guided Beatrice past before Caroline could form a reply, her face mottled with fury. After they had moved beyond hearing range, Alexander apologized quietly for society's casual cruelty, and Beatrice responded with honesty born of long experience that she had accepted years ago that she would never meet the standards by which women were judged and found wanting. And she saw his jaw tighten with an anger that seemed directed not at her, but on her behalf, as he said with low intensity that perhaps the standards themselves were flawed rather than those who failed to meet them, and their conversation deepened into territory she had never explored with anyone, discussing the arbitrary nature of worth and judgment and the violence of reducing human beings to decorative objects valued only for youth and conventional beauty. They encountered Lord Thomas Westbrook riding with Eleanor Fairfax, and the brief stop for greetings revealed Eleanor's obvious approval shining in her eyes as she smiled at Beatrice with warm encouragement, and Thomas engaged Alexander in easy banter that spoke of deep friendship while subtly observing his friend's attentiveness to Beatrice with satisfaction, and after they parted to continue their respective rides, Alexander asked if Beatrice would like to see his favorite path that wound through a quieter section of the park, where ancient oaks created a canopy of green shade, and she agreed with growing trust, following him along the secluded trail where the sounds of fashionable society faded and only bird song and the soft footfalls of their horses broke the peaceful silence. On the evening of April 22nd, when Beatrice arrived at Lady Westbrook's elegant townhouse for the soirée, with her aunt beside her still fussing with the folds of the new gown that had been delivered just that afternoon, a confection of rose silk that brought unexpected colour to Beatrice's complexion, and had been accompanied by a note from Alexander explaining that he had taken the liberty of consulting her aunt about a small gift and hoped she would accept it in the spirit of friendship in which it was offered. She felt herself to be a different woman than the one who had danced alone on a terrace just 7 days earlier, transformed not by the gown itself, but by the steady warmth of Alexander's attention over these past days of calls and rides and conversations that had gradually convinced her reluctant heart that his interest might actually be genuine. Lady Westbrook greeted them with particular kindness, her status as Thomas's mother making her a natural ally in Alexander's courtship, and she whispered to Beatrice as she passed that the Duke had arrived 20 minutes early and had been watching the door with barely concealed impatience. And indeed, when Beatrice entered the candlelit drawing-room, where perhaps 40 guests circulated with champagne and conversation, Alexander's gaze found her immediately, and he crossed the room with such obvious purpose that the assembled company fell briefly silent to observe this unprecedented display of marked attention from the notoriously aloof Duke of Harrington. He bowed over her hand with perfect formality before requesting her dance card, and when she admitted with habitual embarrassment that she had none because no one ever requested dances from her, he produced a small card from his pocket along with a pencil and wrote his name across every single line before handing it to her with a slight smile that made her breath catch, and the murmur of astonishment that rippled through the watching crowd was audible enough that even Aunt Harriet flushed with vicarious pride. The musicians began with a country dance that allowed for conversation as the patterns wove couples together and apart, and Alexander spoke easily about a book he had been reading and asked her opinion on the author's treatment of moral philosophy, drawing her into discussion that made her forget the watching eyes and whispers. And when the waltz was announced and he led her onto the floor among the other couples, Beatrice felt her heart begin to race with the memory of dancing alone under moonlight, and the profound difference of dancing now, with Alexander's hand warm and steady at her waist, and his other hand clasping hers with gentle firmness as the music began. They moved together with an ease that surprised her, his lead confident but responsive to her own movement, and she realized with wonder that this was what she had been missing during her solitary dance, not the steps or the music, but this perfect synchronicity of two people moving as one. And Alexander murmured near her ear that partnership was infinitely better than solitude, no matter how graceful the solo, and she looked up to find his grey eyes intense with meaning that went far beyond waltzing, and the crowded room seemed to fall away until there was only the music, and his steady presence, and the floating sensation of her rose silk skirts swirling around them as they turned and turned again. She glimpsed Lady Caroline's face tight with fury as they swept past, saw Eleanor smiling with delight, and Thomas watching his friend with satisfied approval, felt the weight of society's collective attention observing this public claiming, but none of it mattered because Alexander was looking at her as though she were the only woman in the room, in London, in the entire world. And when the music ended, he was slow to release her, his hands lingering at her waist, and in hers for several heartbeats longer than propriety strictly allowed. And then he leaned close enough that his breath stirred the small curls near her ear, and whispered that he had a matter of great importance to discuss with her, and would she grant him a private audience tomorrow morning at 11? And she managed to whisper yes, through the emotion closing her throat. And he smiled with such open joy that she felt answering happiness bloom dangerously bright in her chest, even as her mind whispered warnings about hoping too much, and fearing too greatly, and the vast distance between a duke and an overlooked spinster that no amount of waltzing could entirely bridge. On the morning of April the 23rd, Beatrice woke before dawn after a night of fractured sleep, haunted by dreams of ballrooms and waltzing and grey eyes that looked at her as though she mattered. And she dressed with trembling hands in her second-best morning gown of soft blue muslin, because her best had been worn to Lady Westbrook's soirée and still smelled faintly of the rose water she had dabbed at her wrists in nervous preparation. And by the time Aunt Harriet descended for breakfast at 8:30, her niece had already rearranged the drawing-room 3 times and checked her appearance in the hall mirror so often that even the usually oblivious aunt remarked with uncharacteristic gentleness that she looked lovely, and the Duke would be a fool not to see it, which only made Beatrice's anxiety spike higher, because her aunt's kindness meant that even she recognized the significance of this morning call and the private audience Alexander had requested with such careful formality at the end of last night's waltz. The hours crawled past with excruciating slowness as Beatrice attempted to occupy herself with embroidery and then a book and then correspondence, but her hands shook too badly to manage the needle, and the words on the page blurred into meaningless shapes, and she could not for the life of her remember what she had meant to write to her cousin in Bath. So she finally abandoned all pretense of occupation and simply sat in the drawing-room watching the clock on the mantel tick toward 11 while her mind raced through every possible outcome of the impending interview, and her heart alternated between wild hope and crushing dread. At precisely 11, the door-knocker sounded with the firm confidence that she had come to associate with Alexander's arrivals. And she heard the footman's steps in the hall and the low murmur of masculine voice, and then her aunt was ushering the Duke of Harrington into the drawing-room with an expression of barely suppressed excitement, before withdrawing with transparent haste, and closing the door behind her in flagrant disregard for propriety, leaving Beatrice alone with Alexander in the morning light that streamed through the windows and illuminated the shabby gentility of the furniture and the worn patches in the carpet that suddenly seemed glaringly obvious. He stood just inside the door for a moment, looking at her with an intensity that made her breath catch, dressed in dark blue superfine that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders and buckskin breeches that demonstrated the powerful lines of his legs. And she saw him holding a small velvet box in his left hand, and the sight of it made her heart stutter with the realization that this was truly happening, that Alexander Harrington, Duke of Harrington, was standing in her modest drawing-room, holding what could only be a ring-box, and looking at her with an expression that mingled determination and tenderness, and something that looked almost like vulnerability. And then he crossed the room in 3 long strides and went down on one knee before her chair with a grace that spoke of athletic strength, and took her trembling hand in his warm, steady one, and said her name, just Beatrice, with such feeling that tears sprang to her eyes even before he spoke. The words she had never dared hope to hear, asking if she would do him the very great honor of becoming his wife. Her first impulse was disbelief so profound that she wondered if she had somehow misheard or misunderstood, despite the clarity of his words and the unmistakable sight of him kneeling before her with the velvet box in his hand. And her second impulse was to laugh at the absurdity of Alexander Harrington, Duke of Harrington, asking plain Beatrice Thornhill spinster, of 28 with no fortune and no beauty and no prospects to become his duchess. But the laughter died in her throat when she looked into his grey eyes and saw nothing but absolute sincerity and patient hope, and something deeper that made her chest constrict with almost painful intensity. And she realized with a sensation like falling that he was waiting for her answer, and that her silence was stretching too long, and that she needed to speak, but her voice seemed to have abandoned her entirely, along with her capacity for coherent thought. The sensible part of her mind that had learned through 7 seasons of rejection to expect nothing and hope for less was screaming that this must be some mistake, or cruel joke, or fever dream from which she would wake to find herself alone in her narrow bed in the unfashionable townhouse with nothing changed. But the rest of her was entirely focused on the warmth of his hand holding hers, and the vulnerable set of his shoulders as he knelt, and the faint line between his brows that suggested actual anxiety about her response, as though he genuinely feared she might refuse him. Which was so ridiculous that she finally found her voice enough to whisper his name as a question. He smiled then with such tenderness that tears spilled over her lashes and tracked down her cheeks, and he reached up with his free hand to brush them away with his thumb in a gesture of such gentle intimacy that it broke something open in her chest, and he said that he knew this was sudden, and that he had perhaps not courted her for as long as convention demanded, but that he had known from the moment he saw her dancing alone in the moonlight that she was extraordinary, and that every conversation and ride and dance since had only confirmed his initial certainty that she was exactly the woman he had been waiting for without knowing what he sought. She made a sound that was half laugh and half sob, and asked how he could possibly say such things when she was nothing special and had been passed over by every man in London for nearly a decade, and his expression shifted to something fierce and almost angry as he told her that every man in London was a fool and that their blindness did not diminish her worth any more than his title increased his, and that if she would have him, he would spend the rest of his life ensuring she never doubted her value again. And then he opened the velvet box to reveal a ring of sapphires and diamonds that caught the morning light and threw small rainbows across the shabby carpet, and asked again with quiet intensity if she would consent to be his wife and his partner, and his love for whatever years they were granted. She looked into his grey eyes that had watched her with such steady certainty since that moonlit terrace, and saw nothing but truth and devotion and a future she had never allowed herself to imagine. And she felt the weight of 7 seasons of rejection and dismissal and quiet resignation begin to crack and fall away like ice breaking on a spring river, and she whispered yes with a voice that shook with emotion before saying it again more strongly. Yes, she would marry him and be his wife and his partner and spend whatever years they were granted learning what it meant to be truly seen and valued by another soul. His face transformed with a joy so pure and unguarded that it made him look years younger as he slipped the sapphire ring onto her trembling finger, where it settled as though it had been made for her hand alone. And then he was rising from his knees and pulling her up into his arms in a breach of propriety that would have scandalized Aunt Harriet had she been present to witness it, but Beatrice could not bring herself to care about propriety when Alexander was holding her against his chest with a tenderness that made her feel precious beyond measure, and whispering her name against her hair like a prayer of thanksgiving. She felt his heart beating strong and steady beneath her cheek, and marveled that this man, this duke who could have chosen any woman in England, had instead chosen her, and was holding her as though she were something infinitely valuable that he feared to break. And when he finally pulled back enough to look down at her, his eyes were bright with emotion that matched her own. He told her that he would obtain a special license so they need not wait the traditional weeks for banns to be read, because he had already waited 32 years to find her, and had no intention of prolonging their engagement any longer than absolutely necessary. And she laughed through her tears at his imperious tone that was so characteristically him even as his hands were gentle on her shoulders. And she agreed that she saw no reason to wait when they were both quite certain of their hearts and had no need of a lengthy courtship to confirm what they already knew. He kissed her forehead with reverent care, and then her cheeks where tears still tracked, and finally her lips in a soft, sweet kiss that held promise of deeper passion to come, but remained respectful of her innocence and the morning hour, and the fact that her aunt was undoubtedly listening at the keyhole, and when he lifted his head, his smile held such warmth and satisfaction that Beatrice felt answering happiness bloom in her chest like roses opening to summer sun. He told her he would speak to her aunt formally to request permission, though they both knew it was mere formality at this point. And then he would begin arrangements for their wedding, which he hoped to accomplish within a fortnight, if she had no objections, and she shook her head mutely, because she could not imagine objecting to anything that would make her his wife sooner rather than later. He requested a private word with Aunt Harriet first, which sent that good woman into fluttering excitement as she withdrew with him to the small parlour, while Beatrice waited in the drawing-room, with her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles showed white against the rose silk of her morning dress, and she tried to calm her racing heart by rehearsing reasonable explanations for this visit that did not involve the terrifying hope that had taken root in her chest, despite all her efforts to maintain sensible expectations. But when her aunt emerged some 15 minutes later with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks and her handkerchief pressed to her mouth, and nodded permission for Alexander to enter alone before departing with unusual tact, Beatrice felt her careful composure shatter like spun glass dropped on marble. Alexander closed the door behind him with deliberate care and turned to face her with an expression so tender and determined that her breath caught in her throat, and she rose on trembling legs as he crossed the faded carpet to stand before her. And there was a moment of profound silence in which she was acutely aware of every detail, including the way morning light slanted through the window to illuminate the silver threads at his temples, and the faint scent of sandalwood that clung to his coat, and the precise grey of his eyes that had watched her with such steady regard these past days. He took both her hands in his with a gentleness that belied his evident tension, and told her that he had never been a man of particular eloquence, despite his education and position, but that he found himself wishing desperately for the words of poets who might adequately express what he felt when he looked at her. And when she opened her mouth to protest this characterization of himself, he shook his head with a small smile and asked her to please allow him to finish before his courage failed him entirely, which was such an absurd thing for a duke to say that she fell silent in wondering attention. He said that he had spent 32 years believing himself content with duty and title and the empty social performances that constituted his life, until he saw her dancing alone in the moonlight with such grace and freedom and unconscious beauty that something fundamental shifted in his understanding of what he wanted and needed and deserved, and that every moment spent in her company since had only deepened his certainty that she was the extraordinary woman he had unknowingly been seeking through all those empty years of going through motions and fulfilling expectations. She felt tears begin to blur her vision as he continued speaking in that low, intense voice about how her honesty and wit and courage in the face of society's cruelty had illuminated qualities he had never valued in himself, but recognized instantly in her, and how the thought of returning to his previous existence without her presence to enliven and challenge and comfort him had become unendurable. And then he released one of her hands to reach into his coat pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. And her heart seemed to stop entirely as he lowered himself to one knee before her with a fluid grace that spoke of the same physical competence she had felt when they waltzed together, and he opened the box to reveal a ring while asking in a voice that shook slightly, despite his obvious efforts at control, whether she would consent to become his wife and duchess and partner for whatever years God granted them together. He left her reluctantly an hour later, after they had discussed practical arrangements with Aunt Harriet, who wept and laughed in equal measure and declared herself overwhelmed by such unexpected happiness for her dear niece. And when the door closed behind him, Beatrice sank onto the settee with trembling legs and stared at the sapphire ring on her finger that caught the afternoon light and threw blue fire across the faded wallpaper, and she had to press her hand against her chest to contain the wild joy that threatened to overflow in most unseemly fashion. The following days passed in a blur of activity, as Alexander proved as efficient in wedding arrangements as he was in all other matters, obtaining the special license within 48 hours through connections. Beatrice did not care to examine too closely, and engaging the services of a modiste, who arrived at the townhouse with bolts of ivory silk and Brussels lace to create a wedding gown worthy of a duchess despite the abbreviated timeline, and Aunt Harriet threw herself into preparations with an energy that belied her 60 years, while Eleanor called daily to assist and exclaim over each new development with satisfying enthusiasm. Alexander himself was a constant presence during those 2 weeks, calling each afternoon and escorting Beatrice on morning rides and evening drives with a proprietary attention that left no doubt of his devotion, and society, which had ignored her so thoroughly for 7 seasons, now watched with avid interest as the unapproachable Duke of Harrington conducted a whirlwind courtship of the woman they had dismissed as a hopeless spinster, and the whispers that followed them ranged from romantic admiration to spiteful speculation about what arts she must have employed to catch such a prize. Lady Caroline attempted one final intervention by calling on Alexander at his townhouse to express concern about the haste of his decision and suggest that a man of his position deserved more consideration before binding himself to a woman of such modest background and faded youth. But he received her with icy courtesy and informed her that he considered Miss Thornhill the most exceptional woman of his acquaintance, and that her attempts to disparage his future wife were both unwelcome and ineffective. And when Lady Caroline departed in offended fury, Thomas, who had been present to witness the exchange, remarked with satisfaction that Caroline had finally overplayed her hand and would find her influence in society much diminished once Alexander's marriage made clear where his loyalties lay. Beatrice herself moved through those days in a state of wondering disbelief that occasionally crystallized into moments of sharp clarity when Alexander would look at her with such warmth and certainty that she felt the last remnants of her protective doubt crumble away, and gradually she allowed herself to believe that this extraordinary gift was real and lasting, and meant for her, despite all the years that had suggested otherwise, and she felt herself unfurling like a flower too long kept in shadow, finally brought into sunlight. The wedding was set for May 8th, 1815, a morning ceremony at St. George's, Hanover Square, with only close friends and family in attendance. And as the date approached, Beatrice found her nervousness giving way to impatience to begin this new chapter of her life as Alexander's wife and partner. The morning of May 8th, 1815, dawned with such radiant clarity that Beatrice took it as Providence smiling upon her improbable happiness, and she woke in her narrow bed at the townhouse for the final time as Miss Thornhill, with a heart so full of joy and trepidation that she had to press both hands against her chest to contain the wild flutter of emotion. Eleanor arrived at 7 that morning with the modiste and 2 assistants in tow to help with the elaborate preparations, and the next 3 hours passed in a flurry of activity as Beatrice was bathed and dressed and coiffed with a care she had never before experienced. And when she finally stood before the long mirror in her aunt's chamber, wearing the ivory silk gown with its delicate lace overlay and seed pearl embellishments, she hardly recognized the elegant woman who gazed back at her with wondering eyes. The gown fit her slender figure perfectly, with long sleeves and a modest neckline that somehow enhanced rather than concealed, and the modiste had arranged her dark hair in an intricate style that incorporated the pearl combs Alexander had sent the previous week, and Eleanor declared with satisfying certainty that she had never seen a more beautiful bride, despite all the grand weddings they had attended over the years. Aunt Harriet wept openly as she fastened the pearl necklace that had belonged to Beatrice's mother around her niece's throat, and told her that she looked exactly as her mother had on her own wedding day some 30 years prior. And Beatrice felt the bittersweet ache of wishing her parents could witness this day they had never expected to see, given her prolonged spinsterhood and uncertain prospects. The carriage arrived promptly at 10 to convey them the short distance to St. George's, Hanover Square, and as they travelled through the morning streets, Beatrice clutched her bouquet of white roses and tried to calm her racing heart by reminding herself that Alexander had chosen her freely and repeatedly over these past weeks, and that his devotion had been demonstrated through consistent action as well as words. The church loomed before them in all its columned grandeur, and as the footman handed her down from the carriage, she saw Thomas waiting at the entrance to escort Aunt Harriet inside. And he gave Beatrice an encouraging smile and told her that Alexander had been pacing the vestry since 9 that morning like a caged lion, which made her laugh despite her nerves. Eleanor took her arm, and they waited in the narthex as the organist began the processional hymn, and through the open doors Beatrice could see the small gathering of guests turning to watch for her entrance. And then her eyes found Alexander standing at the altar in his formal black coat with Thomas beside him, and the expression on his face when he saw her approaching drove every doubt from her mind as surely as sunlight disperses morning fog, and she walked forward into her new life with steady steps and a full heart. The ceremony itself passed like a dream, illuminated by shafts of coloured light filtering through the stained glass windows, and Beatrice found herself trembling as she stood beside Alexander before the elderly rector whose sonorous voice intoned the ancient words of the marriage service that had bound countless couples across the centuries. And when Alexander took her hand in his to speak his vows, his grip was warm and steady, and his voice rang clear through the church as he promised to love and cherish her for all the days of their lives with such unmistakable sincerity that she felt tears prick her eyes. Her own voice wavered slightly as she repeated the vows that made her his wife, but she spoke each word with full awareness of its weight and meaning. And when Alexander slipped the gold wedding band onto her finger beside the sapphire engagement ring, she looked up into his face and saw such profound satisfaction there that her last lingering doubt about her worthiness dissolved completely, and she understood that he truly saw her as the treasure he had claimed her to be, despite all evidence society had offered to the contrary for 28 years. The rector pronounced them man and wife with jovial warmth, and Alexander lifted her hand to his lips in a gesture so tender that Aunt Harriet's audible sob echoed through the small church. And then he drew Beatrice close and kissed her softly, while Thomas applauded and Eleanor wept happily, and the handful of other witnesses smiled at the obvious devotion between the unlikely couple who had found each other against all reasonable expectation. They processed down the aisle together as the organ swelled in triumphant celebration, and Beatrice caught glimpses of familiar faces as they passed, with Eleanor beaming through tears and Thomas grinning broadly, and even the rector's wife dabbing at her eyes. And when they emerged into the brilliant May sunshine, she had to blink against the sudden brightness that seemed to mirror the radiance expanding in her chest. A small crowd had gathered outside the church, having heard rumours that the Duke of Harrington was marrying that morning, and there were murmurs of surprise when they saw the bride was the unremarkable Miss Thornhill who had languished on the social periphery for so many seasons. But Alexander seemed utterly unconcerned with their reaction as he handed Beatrice into his elegant carriage with its ducal crest emblazoned on the door and climbed in beside her. The moment the door closed, and they were enclosed in relative privacy, he pulled her into his arms and kissed her with considerably more passion than the chaste ceremony kiss. And when he finally released her, she was breathless and blushing, and felt thoroughly claimed as his duchess, in a way that had nothing to do with legal documents or spoken vows, and he smiled at her with such warmth that she had to look away from the intensity of his gaze, which saw too clearly into the depths of her newly awakened heart. The carriage bore them swiftly through the London streets toward Harrington House, which would now be her home as Alexander's Duchess, and Beatrice sat nestled against her husband's side, with his arm wrapped securely around her shoulders in a possessive embrace that made her feel both cherished and claimed in the most thrilling way, and she could scarcely believe that mere 3 weeks ago she had been resigned to spinsterhood and invisibility, while now she wore a duchess's title and wedding ring and travelled toward a future she had never dared imagine in her most secret hopes. The journey took only 20 minutes through the increasingly fashionable streets until the carriage turned into a tree-lined square and drew up before an elegant Georgian townhouse with gleaming white columns and wrought iron balconies, and Alexander helped her down with such careful attention that she felt like precious porcelain, despite knowing herself to be merely ordinary Beatrice Thornhill, who had somehow been transformed by his impossible regard into Her Grace the Duchess of Harrington. The household staff had assembled in the entrance hall to greet their new mistress with the housekeeper and butler at the front of 2 neat rows of footmen and maids and kitchen workers who all bowed and curtsied as Alexander led Beatrice inside, and he introduced Mrs. Edwards, the housekeeper, and Harrison the butler, who had both served the family for 30 years, and welcomed her with genuine warmth that suggested Alexander had prepared them to receive his unconventional bride with respect rather than judgment. The house itself was magnificent in its restrained elegance, with high ceilings and tall windows that flooded the rooms with light and furnishings that spoke of generations of wealth and taste. And as Alexander guided her through the main floor, pointing out the drawing room and library and music room and dining room, Beatrice felt increasingly overwhelmed by the sheer grandeur of her new circumstances and the vast distance between this palatial residence and the modest townhouse she had shared with Aunt Harriet for so many years. Alexander must have sensed her growing anxiety, because he drew her into the library and closed the door behind them to create a private sanctuary away from the servants' curious eyes, and he took both her hands in his and told her with quiet intensity that she must never feel intimidated by the house or the title or the responsibilities, because none of it mattered as much as the fact that she was his wife and he loved her, and together they would create whatever life they wished, regardless of society's expectations or traditions. His words steadied her racing heart, and she looked up into his face, which showed nothing but devotion and certainty. And she told him with trembling honesty that she had spent 28 years believing herself inadequate, and it would take time to fully embrace this new identity as someone worthy of such devotion and such a magnificent life. And he smiled and kissed her forehead, and said they had all the time in the world for her to learn what he had known from that first night when he saw her dancing alone in the moonlight with such unconscious grace and passion. The afternoon stretched before them with a languorous quality as Alexander led Beatrice up the grand staircase to the private apartments on the 2nd floor where the family chambers were located away from the formal public rooms below, and she felt her heart begin to race as she realized they were truly alone now, as husband and wife with no chaperone required and no proprieties to observe beyond those they chose for themselves. And the weight of that freedom was both exhilarating and terrifying to someone who had spent 28 years under the constant surveillance of society's judgment. Alexander opened a door into a sitting room decorated in soft blues and creams, with afternoon sunlight streaming through tall windows that overlooked the private garden behind the house, and he told her this suite had belonged to his mother, and was now hers to arrange however she wished, and she could see through an open doorway into a bedroom beyond with an enormous 4-poster bed draped in ivory silk that made her blush and look away quickly. He smiled at her obvious nervousness and drew her to a comfortable sofa near the windows, and they sat together with his arm around her shoulders in the same protective embrace he had maintained in the carriage, and he told her gently that she should never feel pressured or anxious about any aspect of their marriage because he loved her and wanted only her happiness and comfort, regardless of society's expectations about wedding nights or ducal obligations to produce heirs. His thoughtfulness only made her love him more desperately, and she turned in his embrace to look directly into his face and told him with trembling honesty that she was not afraid of him or their marriage bed, but rather of her own inexperience and ignorance about such matters, since no one had ever thought to educate a confirmed spinster in the intimate details of married life, and she did not wish to disappoint him through awkwardness or inadequacy, after he had honored her with such devotion. Alexander's expression softened with profound tenderness, and he cupped her face in both his hands and kissed her slowly and thoroughly, until she was breathless and clinging to his shoulders. And then he drew back just enough to look into her eyes and told her that nothing she could do would ever disappoint him, because he had not married her for practiced skill or worldly sophistication, but rather for the passionate authenticity he had glimpsed when she danced alone in the moonlight, believing herself unobserved. He promised her they would learn together how to please each other and build their intimacy at whatever pace felt natural and right. And there was no schedule or expectation beyond mutual tenderness and discovery. And his patient reassurance dissolved the last of her anxiety and replaced it with wondering anticipation about the mysteries that awaited her in his arms. The late afternoon sun had shifted lower in the sky by the time they emerged from the private apartments with flushed cheeks and disheveled clothing that spoke eloquently of the intimacies they had shared in that ivory-draped bed. And though Beatrice felt her face burn with embarrassment at what the servants must surely deduce from their long seclusion and her obvious disarray, Alexander seemed utterly unconcerned with propriety as he kept his arm firmly around her waist and guided her back downstairs to the library, where he insisted they should have tea and simply be together without any demands or obligations for the remainder of their wedding day. "Mrs. Bickett," Edwards brought the tea service herself, with a knowing smile that was kind rather than judgmental, and told Beatrice that dinner would be served whenever their graces desired it, and Beatrice realized with wonder that she now had the authority to determine household schedules and routines, rather than living at the mercy of others' decisions as she had done for 28 years in her aunt's house. Alexander poured the tea himself with careful attention to how she preferred it with cream and 1 sugar, and they sat together on the leather sofa before the library fire, which a footman had built up against the spring evening's cooling temperature. And for long moments they simply existed in comfortable silence, while Beatrice tried to absorb the magnitude of everything that had changed in the span of barely 8 days since that fateful ball, when she had danced alone on the terrace and caught the attention of a duke who saw past her plain face and spinster status to the passionate soul beneath. She found herself studying Alexander's profile as he gazed into the fire with his teacup balanced on his knee and his free hand resting possessively on her waist, and she marveled that this remarkable man who could have chosen any accomplished beauty in society had instead pursued her with such determination and married her despite every obstacle and scandal, and she finally allowed herself to believe fully that his devotion was real and permanent, rather than some temporary madness that would fade once novelty wore thin. Alexander must have sensed her regard, because he turned his head to meet her eyes with an expression of such profound contentment that it stole her breath, and he told her quietly that he had never imagined marriage could feel like this sense of rightness and completion, and he was grateful beyond words that she had taken the risk of accepting his hasty courtship, despite all her reasonable doubts. Beatrice set down her teacup and turned more fully toward him to cup his face in both her hands the way he had done to her so many times. And she told him with trembling honesty that he had given her a life and identity she had never dared hope for, and transformed her from invisible spinster to beloved wife, and she would spend the rest of their years together trying to be worthy of such devotion.